The sun rose over the quiet suburban streets, a perfect facade of calm and order. From the outside, the neighborhood seemed like a dream, well-manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and rows of nearly identical houses that whispered promises of comfort and community. But behind those gates and white picket fences, a storm was brewing, one that would test every ounce of patience and resolve a homeowner could muster. It started with a letter, slipped neatly under the door in the dead of night. The envelope bore the unmistakable insignia of the Homeowners Association, a small symbol that carried enormous power over everyone's lives in the neighborhood. Inside, the notice was simple, a fine for leaving a recycling bin visible on trash day. No warning, no discussion, just a cold, calculated decree. The amount was small, almost laughable, but the principle was suffocating. At first, it seemed like a misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA had made a mistake. But the mistakes kept coming. Another notice arrived the next week, this time for having an unapproved garden gnome in the front yard. Then the driveway was allegedly stained, a violation so petty it seemed absurd. Each fine was accompanied by a strict deadline and a threat of escalating penalties. It wasn't just the fines, it was the tone. Each letter read like an accusation, a statement of control designed to instill fear. Homeowners were not considered neighbors, they were subjects under the rigid thumb of the HOA board, and I quickly realized I was now trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. Days turned into weeks, and the fines multiplied. Every attempt to appeal or reason with the board was met with silence or condescending replies. They wielded their power with surgical precision, picking apart the minutiae of life in my own home. The mailbox, the lawn, the choice of curtains, they monitored everything, as if the neighborhood belonged to them rather than the people who lived there. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones about their own struggles. One couple had been fined for installing solar panels, another had been penalized for painting their house a slightly different shade than the board deemed acceptable. The community that once promised security and friendship now thrived on tension and fear, with the HOA serving as an unchallenged ruler. I began documenting every interaction, every fine, every petty accusation. Receipts, photos, timestamps, each one a piece of evidence in a growing mountain of injustice. The unfairness gnawed at me, not just as a homeowner, but as someone who had invested years of hard work into a place they loved, only to be harassed by faceless bureaucrats who seemed to enjoy wielding control over the lives of others. One afternoon, I discovered that the HOA board meetings were private, held behind locked doors with agendas that were carefully curated to exclude dissenting voices. The more I observed, the more I realized the pattern: these were not people acting in the community's best interest. They were acting in their own, using fines and rules as tools of intimidation, thriving on the compliance of everyone else. Frustration turned into determination. I knew that fighting them one fine at a time was a losing battle, the system was stacked in their favor. But every rule, every fine, every silent dismissal of my appeals fueled an idea, a plan that slowly began to take shape. If the HOA was a fortress of petty tyranny, perhaps it could be turned into a battlefield of its own making. Late nights were spent researching laws, HOA regulations, and property records. I mapped out the financial structure of the board, tracing accounts, budgets, and ownership details. I discovered that the very organization that claimed to protect homeowners had significant assets, and in theory, anyone with enough resources and cunning could acquire control. A sense of clarity emerged. I didn't just want to fight the fines, I wanted to rewrite the rules. I wanted to reclaim the neighborhood, not through petty defiance, but through absolute authority. I wanted to turn the tables so thoroughly that the board, which had tormented me and countless others, would have no choice but to answer to me. And so, the quiet calm of the neighborhood hid a secret: beneath the orderly lawns and neatly trimmed hedges, a storm was gathering. A storm fueled by weeks of unfair treatment, sleepless nights, and a burning desire to take back what was mine. What started as frustration and fear had now evolved into a meticulously calculated plan, one that would take patience, strategy, and no small amount of audacity. By the time I closed my laptop that night, the pieces of the puzzle were almost aligned. Every fine, every petty rule, every overbearing board member had become part of a map that led directly to the heart of the HOA. The next steps would require precision, courage, and the audacity to act where others had merely grumbled. The battle had only just begun. The HOA thought it had control over me, but it was about to learn that control can be seized, rules can be rewritten, and tyrants can be dethroned. The first chapter of this war was over, but the real game, the one where power would shift and revenge would be exacted, was about to begin. The weeks that followed became a silent preparation phase, a period of intense focus and unwavering resolve. While the HOA continued its relentless campaign of fines and intimidation, a very different battle was being waged behind closed doors, one that the board never anticipated. Every petty infraction they issued only strengthened the determination driving the plan forward. The more deeply I studied the HOA's structure, the clearer the path became. Beneath the arrogance and authoritarian facade, the organization was fragile, held together by outdated bylaws, internal disagreements, and a financial model that was far more vulnerable than the board understood. All it needed was pressure in the right places, applied with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a strategist. I began by identifying homeowners who were fed up with the constant surveillance and absurd regulations. The neighborhood had endured years of the board's tyranny, and many residents were living in quiet misery, afraid to speak up but eager for change. Through discreet conversations and careful observation, I identified the most frustrated, the ones who felt trapped but lacked a way out. Quietly, I acquired proxy voting rights from as many of them as possible. Each homeowner, eager for relief, willingly handed over their vote in exchange for the possibility of a more balanced, fair community. These agreements were legally binding, meticulously documented, and strategically timed to take effect right before the HOA's annual election, an election the board had always taken for granted. The dollar. With calculated steps, I began purchasing them, one by one. Each acquisition increased my voting power within the HOA, but more importantly, it increased my influence over the organization's internal financial structure. The board never noticed. They were too fixated on policing lawns and mailboxes to see the shifting power under their feet. As I quietly gained control, the HOA continued its barrage of fines against me, escalating their efforts in an attempt to break my resolve. They issued threats, warnings, and exaggerated claims of violations that stretched the limits of credibility. But where they expected compliance, fear, or retreat, they instead encountered silence. And in that silence, I planned my final move. By the time the annual meeting approached, the balance had shifted completely. The neighborhood was unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, but the numbers were undeniable. Through proxy votes and property acquisitions, I had secured a majority stake in the HOA's decision-making process. The moment the meeting began, the outcome was already determined. The board, seated at the front of the room, carried their usual air of superiority. They opened the proceedings with the same condescending routine, completely ignorant of the power shift that was about to unfold. Their expressions shifted from boredom to shock as the proxy forms were presented, the votes tallied, and the results revealed. With a simple, legal majority vote, the board was removed from power, each member relieved of their positions in a stunning reversal that left the room buzzing with disbelief. Their reign, built on intimidation and abusive authority, crumbled in minutes. The very rules they had used to terrorize homeowners now worked against them, dismantling their control with mathematical precision. The new board, hand-picked, responsible, and balanced, was sworn in almost immediately. But the most crucial position was the one I designated for myself, HOA president. Not out of ego or vanity, but because the power to correct years of injustice now rested squarely in my hands. The former board members stood speechless, caught between disbelief and outrage. They demanded explanations, attempted accusations, and clung to the last remnants of their authority. But the legal documents were clear, the votes were legitimate, and the homeowners had spoken without uttering a single word. In that moment, the shift was complete. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression and mismanagement, now belonged to someone who understood its flaws, its potential, and its weaknesses. Someone who had prepared meticulously, waited patiently, and acted decisively. But the story didn't end with their removal. A deeper twist awaited, one that would transform the entire neighborhood and ensure that the former board would feel the weight of their actions in a way they never expected. Because taking control was only the beginning. The true revenge, the kind that reshapes an entire community and exposes the cracks in its foundation, was still to come. And it would strike at the heart of what the former board valued most, their homes. The air in the neighborhood shifted almost immediately. Where tension and fear had once ruled, now there was cautious excitement, and a subtle undercurrent of reckoning. The former HOA board, once untouchable tyrants, now found themselves on the outside, staring at the very system they had controlled with such arrogance. But I wasn't finished. Removal from power was only the beginning. The real payoff required creativity, audacity, and a meticulous understanding of both law and leverage. I began by reviewing the financial portfolios of the former board members. Each of them had invested heavily in their homes, believing the neighborhood was stable, predictable, and beyond challenge. Their assets were their pride, and the very thing they assumed guaranteed their security became the tool of justice. Using my new authority, I identified a rarely noticed clause buried deep within the HOA bylaws, one that allowed the board, under certain circumstances, to require property owners to come into compliance with unresolved financial obligations or face escalated liens. It was obscure, technical, and overlooked, but now it was perfectly in my hands. First, I focused on subtle disruption. Notices were issued, legally correct but strategically designed, to expose every technical violation they themselves had ignored. Unpaid minor dues, small code infractions, overlooked landscaping requirements, all resurfaced under my watch. The former board members suddenly found themselves receiving the same relentless scrutiny and fines they had once imposed on everyone else. Panic replaced arrogance, confusion replaced certainty. Their carefully curated sense of invincibility was unraveling fast. Next came the most audacious step. I offered to buy back their homes. Not at arbitrary prices, but at a fraction of their value, citing minor technical violations, liens, and the exact regulations they had once wielded with impunity. It was a brilliant reversal, turning the very system they created against them. Faced with the prospect of legal battles, mounting fines, and the inevitability of compliance, they were left with no choice but to sell. One by one, the properties of the former board members returned to my ownership, each transaction executed with legal precision and undeniable authority. The transformation of the neighborhood was immediate and dramatic. Where fear once reigned, order and fairness now prevailed. Homeowners watched with wide-eyed astonishment as the neighborhood's chaos was corrected. Fences were repaired, landscaping guidelines were rationalized, and rules that had once punished harmless homeowners were rewritten to be sensible and enforceable. The HOA had become a model of fairness, efficiency, and respect, but more importantly, it had become a symbol of accountability. The former board, now stripped of influence and property, were forced to live under the rules they once dictated. They experienced firsthand the weight of bureaucracy, the sting of fines, and the frustration of regulations that could be merciless if wielded correctly. What had once been a game they controlled became a mirror reflecting their own misdeeds. Every house they had once ruled over was now under the governance of someone who had endured, and outsmarted, their oppressive tactics. But beyond the retribution, there was a lesson for the neighborhood. Power is not eternal, and authority wielded without accountability is fragile. Even the most entrenched tyrants can be undone with patience, strategy, and knowledge. The HOA was no longer a tool of fear, it was a system of order that reminded everyone that rules exist to protect, not to dominate. For me, the victory was more than financial or legal. It was personal. Every fine, every threat, every sleepless night had been transformed into leverage, strategy, and ultimate vindication. The sense of satisfaction was profound. Not only had I reclaimed my peace, but I had also restored fairness to an entire community. The final chapter of this saga was a quiet one in many ways. There were no dramatic confrontations or shouting matches, just the satisfaction of watching the balance of power shift decisively. The former board moved out, the neighborhood healed, and the residents finally breathed freely without the shadow of petty tyranny looming over their lives. As the sun set over the now tranquil streets, the story of how one homeowner turned the tables on an oppressive HOA became more than just a personal victory, it became a cautionary tale. A reminder that patience, intelligence, and careful planning can triumph over arrogance and abuse, and that sometimes, the quietest, most meticulous actions yield the most explosive results. And in the calm that followed, it was clear, the HOA that once ruled with fear was gone. In its place stood fairness, accountability, and a subtle but unmistakable message: tyranny, no matter how well entrenched, can always be challenged, and sometimes, it can be done with style, strategy, and a little poetic justice.